We have Kristy Sakai, who's going to actually be moderating this panel, and thank you everyone else for joining. I really appreciate it. Today we have CEO of Supertext USA, Kristy Sakai. We have Hilary Normanha for localization, program manager at Asics Digital, and Andy Andersen, head of localization at ASO at Tinder. So thank you very much for being with us. Kristy, I'm going to hand this over to you, and I'll pop back in towards the end for any type of QA. All right. Good luck, everyone. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a Hilary. Is she here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yeah, you can hear me. Cool. Thank you, Brian. So yeah, we'll start off with a short introduction to ourselves before we dive straight into talking about the topic of shifting gears in times of crisis. My name is Kristy Sakai. I head up Supertext USA operations, and we're an LSP with a focus on creative content. So we work with localization and marketing teams on translations, trends creations, and multilingual copywriting. And I've known Hilary and Andy for a while now, and it's always a pleasure to chat with you guys. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to learn a little bit more about your experiences. So maybe you can start with an introduction to yourselves.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll go first. Yeah, thanks, Kristy. Thanks, everyone, for putting this on. I'm Andy Andersen. I work on the international growth team at Tinder. I've been at Tinder since 2017. My primary focuses are localization and app store optimization. We provide services in over 50 languages to tens of millions of users worldwide. It's really fun to do. It's a really interesting opportunity just because of the niche we're in. And I think right now it's particularly interesting with all that's going on in the world, is when it comes to like social settings, and we think about the different levels of interest of people and like what their focuses are and priorities at this time in life. So yeah, it's interesting to come together to talk about these kind of things.
And Hilary Normanha. I work at Asics Digital. So Asics Digital is the hub for all things digital for Asics, the shoe company. I personally I'm the program manager for localization of their fitness apps. One of the main apps that I work on is Runkeeper, and also doing some work with one of their recent acquisitions, Race Roster.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, let's get into things. So yeah, this global epidemic, it's really impacted every aspect of life. And there's a lot of dimensions that we could talk about, but for now, I just wanted to focus more on how it's impacted your work in these two really interesting brands. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how Asics and Tinder has responded to the pandemic as a company, and how this shifted your work in localization.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting for us. I think there's a lot of uncertainty at this time. I think that for everyone, we're still figuring out things. I think from us, like we've been reacting in different ways. I think every company's had to be somewhat reactive in this situation because it's an ever evolving situation. We don't really know what the outcome is going to be. We don't really know where everything's going to land in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, how this is going to impact business, how this is going to impact ability to hire, how this to function in different markets. Even for us, we're a brand that brings people together. And right now it's challenging to do that because people can't get together. So it's kind of ironic in the sense that it's something that's hard for us to do our core business at the moment. But we're seeing a lot of digital interactions. I think we're seeing that across the world. And I think people are using social media in ways that we probably never would have thought possible. You've seen the rise in all kinds of different ways of communicating. We see how Zoom right now, I mean, we're all on a Zoom call. I think that's like another way Zoom has changed fundamentally life. I think for everyone knows the name Zoom by now if they didn't before. And so I think for us as a business, more like specific to us at Tinder, I think we've responded in a number of ways. We did like communication in terms of like communicating with our users. We have users worldwide and in every market. And I think the least that we could do, and a lot of other brands at this time, specifically ones that are focused in the social sphere, would be like communicating directly with them and giving them updates and like making sure that they knew, you know, the information that was being passed around from the major health organizations like the WHO or the governmental body entities. I mean, obviously that's not, it's not our necessarily job to make sure that everyone's informed, but it is a responsibility that all companies have, like especially a company like us and others who might be in the social space. So we did that a lot. Another thing that we did, and I think a lot of other companies are doing something similar, is leverage the products that we actually have to manage through the crisis. And so, for example, we have a feature some viewers may be familiar with called Passport. It's a paid feature that's normally available for 2 of the subscription packages that we offer, which is Tinder Plus and Tinder Gold. Normally that Passport feature would be behind, you know, like someone would have to pay to be able to access it. And essentially the very like basics of that feature, what it allows someone to do is to change locations digitally, of course, and to meet people in a new location. Normally Tinder is a location-based app. So for example, if you are based in Los Angeles or New York or wherever, you would set your settings to a circle area around you, a radius. But we actually opened up Passport to all of our users worldwide for the entire month so that people could change their locations, talk to people. You know, they could go into another country and talk to people about how things were going for them, or they could just go to another area and find someone to talk to digitally, which I think is not to get too deep into that right now, but I think that's another topic that we're just seeing worldwide is the digital age of people just not being in social contact with people. It's nice to have someone to talk to. And so we really thought that enabling the Passport feature would allow people to have a higher likeliness of matching and talking with more people around the world. So I think we've responded in a number of ways, but I think just going back for a second, like the macro trend is there's a lot of uncertainty still that we all face.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that actually something like Tinder that brings people together is almost doing more now digitally, that people are forced to meet people online, and it makes actually more sense in a way that it's the tool to connect with other people across the world. I think it's a really cool thing. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
Hilary?
for us, most people don't know this about Asics, but it's actually an acronym in Latin for sound mind, sound body. So we've really tried to put a huge focus on that during this time. So similar to Tinder, we lifted paywalls. For me specifically, I work with fitness apps. So we've tried to find ways to modify the products to encourage users to keep moving and really just keep the whole world moving and staying active, and ways that we can do that creatively for users around the world from home or within whatever restrictions that they're in their individual locations. What that means on a product side, so I work really closely with the product teams. So the product teams have had to shift their focus to different features, or removing certain features, making different features more visible even by region. And then also on a communication side, communicating those changes to our users. And like Andy mentioned, it's really important to make sure that we are in line with the recommendations that are safe movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so how's this changed work for you? Do you, obviously like everyone's working remotely, and that's probably a big shift for a lot of companies, so that's already a big difference. But have these kind of internal changes made something different now when you're trying to collaborate across teams and across your like internal teammates and the localization teams?
Not a huge difference. You know, I think Andy and I are both used to working with a lot of developers, product teams, and traditionally many of those teams are remote. So the same types of meetings, daily stand-ups, grooming meetings with product teams, all of those things. We work in Jira on tickets. So not a huge change in process. I do think that like those drive-by conversations that you might normally have with colleagues, that's gone, but it has opened up. I think for me, being in a different context while I'm working, sometimes that can increase or decrease your creativity when you're trying to problem solve. So definitely the context around me is different, and that changes the way that I might think about solving a problem.
Yeah, echoing what Hilary just said, I think that we haven't seen major changes in our internal operations and teams. I think like obviously like most people in the world that are able to, we have to really step back for a second and first just be thankful that we're able to work from home. I know there are a lot of people in the world who don't have that ability. And so like we as a company, we're able to go digitally really easily. And so by doing that, I think there were probably some hiccups. There were probably some areas like of communication that we've had to get better at. We've had more updates, leadership updates, and we've probably had more meetings. I think, Hilary mentioned stand-ups. We've probably had more stand-ups than we've had normally in the office, just because you don't have those conversations. I do miss an element of like that, the water cooler, quote unquote, conversation where, I go into the kitchen and I'm, talking to someone and I get into a really interesting philosophical conversation, whether it's about work or whether it's about life in general. And I do miss that. And I think we're not going to have as much of that. But generally speaking, I think we were relatively smooth transitioning into going internal. I think that planning has been interesting too, like quarterly planning. I'm sure most companies are doing a lot of that as well. And coming up with plans and coordinating on like what you want to work on and stuff. I think there was always an element of, balancing between someone who's in the office and who's not. And I think in the tech world, we've seen in the last, decade, there's been a huge change into collaborative tools, into tools like, even just to name one, like, like Google Apps for work. Like you've got like Docs and Sheets and all these different things, which makes it incredibly easy to just share a sheet and like have 5 people working on it at the same time. I think like having all that set up in a way makes it easy to scale, from a remote perspective. And I think pretty much, that's been our impact. I don't think it's been, one thing or the other. I think it's just been a transitionary period.
I think that's a good point that you make too, that it's like we're set up in the tech world to really thrive in this type of environment as from a tech perspective. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, have you guys had any changes in how, has it been more of an emergency response that you're dealing with, do you think? Or has it been more like a shift in strategy completely? And do you think that's coming up then as we think about like budgeting and sort of future plans and development products?
It affects everything, right? So it definitely affects budget. It affects the way that we're working together, the products in my case that I'm working on, and how those products work. So I think that it affects all the availability of teams or individual people on your team. So it definitely is far-reaching in its effects, but it's also given, at Asics, we're really wanting to make sure that people have the ability to move and exercise without anything limiting them, any money limiting them, or any tools. And how can we do that? How can we enable users and make sure, from my standpoint, that language is not a barrier? So for me, it's been a time to think creatively around something that has high impact. And I think a lot of the teams are approaching it that way as well. Yes, there's changes and limitations, but it's also an opportunity to think creatively.
Yeah, a little bit on that. I think we've definitely seen some things we have to shift. I think strategy shift, and it's kind of an ever evolving thing, because it's one thing to shift, when you talk about priorities and things, it's one thing to shift when you know the outcome of something, like, there's a general trend in an industry and like we want to shift in that direction. It's another thing to shift when you don't know the future, right? We don't know what life's going to look like in 6 months or a year or something like that. We hope we know what it looks like. We hope that, this is a resolved situation and it's behind us, but we don't know that for sure yet. It's not been confirmed. So I think it's difficult to plan when you don't know the future, but at the same time, there's a component of shifting of priorities. And like, we've definitely like, internally probably pivoted some and saying like, we were working on something, maybe this isn't the thing we want to work on right now, because this isn't going to be the most effective, or it's not going to be the ideal time.
Yeah, so I know from like the vendor side that it's been a crazy couple of months, and it's really showing us like how important like global communication is when you're responding to a crisis. So we've had everything from like press releases to website updates to like product shifts. Yeah, and being like super flexible has been priority for us. Have you had different relationships or different experiences with your vendors through this? And what's been kind of a valuable partnership for you?
I think our vendors have been extremely valuable partners, even in helping us problem solve. I'm really thankful I have great vendors that I work with. Echoing something that Hanato was saying earlier about minimizing touch points, that's really important. So maybe streamlining some processes, and our vendors have been on board with that 100%. That's easy to do when you have a mature localization process set up and automation set up, which we have. But I think that that's something, if someone doesn't have that in place, that would be a way to improve the process, to make sure you have automations, minimizing all the touch points so that your vendors are set up for success.
And do you think that that's something, I mean, you kind of had that set up already. And so what were you kind of, what was the main thing that you were grateful for having set up?
I think quick turnaround times, that's very important. The ability to tackle, having something set up where we can adapt terminology to shifting products, communications, new terms. So having all those processes in place so that we can just throw that at our vendor and they can send it right back. That's so a mature localization process with all of those things set up.
So it's kind of possible because you have good communication and like a strong partnership with vendors.
100%. I think a lot of people in our industry, they don't see vendors as partners. They see vendors as a service. And that's really can hurt you in your overall process. So if you see your vendor as a partner and you really open up and give them the information they need to help you solve a problem, they can really come in and solve it creatively. And also it can show, if we share more information with vendors, it pushes the vendors to evolve in ways to work with us better. If they don't know what the internal decision-making process looks like, they're not set up to help us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think that having like strong vendor partnerships is really crucial. And I think it's more evident now than ever. I think like just in times of uncertainty, in times of crisis, we look to vendors to help us and to keep things going because we have a high dependency on vendor capabilities. And so I think that that's definitely a strong point, is like we need quick turnaround times. We need to be responsive. We need to be able to to queue up and get a bunch of languages ready at a short notice. Sometimes that includes more than just language. Sometimes that includes assets and production quality stuff and things like that. So it does require a flexible, adaptable team. And I think like Hilary's saying, I think like treating vendors as partners and making sure that they're really part of the team is very important. I think one of the interesting things about right now in general is just that, and I think anyone who's on the call that really knows localization would probably agree, but localization is generally not something that we want attention for. It's like, because like if there is attention, it's usually something not so good. It's like people giving feedback for bad localization or something. So I think in high times, people just don't even talk about localization. It's an afterthought. But I think in low times, like right now, or just times of challenge, people realize how important communication is. And when we realize communication, when we start to define communication, it's language, and what is language, and how do we really relate to a global? I mean, for companies like ours, which have users all over the place. I mean, even within a country, sometimes the language is requested, and the communication preferences of those people is quite diverse. And being able to tailor to that is very important as a company, because you have to be able to speak to your users.
Yeah, is there anything that you guys could kind of talk about in terms of quality control when things are so kind of heated and you have a lot going on? You're like demanding fast turnaround times and there's a lot of content and it's really important messaging. How do you kind of control for quality in those kinds of situations?
Yeah, I'll start. So I think for us, quality is always very important, just because we have like a really, we scrutinize the process pretty strongly. We have measures in place internally for our like standard production process where people have to go through, and obviously some of that's standard, which a lot of companies have, whether it's a glossary or style guides and things like of that nature, but that's not really the kind of assessment quality, like the final QA steps. I think we rely a lot. We're fortunate we have market people on the ground in various markets around the world. And a lot of times those people really help us with the kind of back and forths. So we have like the initial passes with the vendors, and the vendors do their passes because they actually have QA checks and we have QA checks with them. But then we have like a round of in-market review. And then at sometimes, for certain other things, maybe we even, have public relations people weigh in or something, depending on the situation. And I think having all those inputs is very important, because I think the more inputs you have into a process, the better quality you'll get as an output. Like if you just kind of get someone to translate something and then send it out to the world, you're just hoping for the best. But I think for us, like typically, we want to make sure that there's multiple eyes on it, because people are going to look at things differently and people are going to interpret things differently. So if we have, one sentence right here that we localize into whatever language, several people in the call might say, this means this to me, this means that to me. We want to really get something to the center. So I think we definitely try to have like a multi-tiered, multi-step process always. So even right now.
Yeah.
I agree. The multi-tiered step process with internal and external partners is really important when you're talking about quality. I also think that the earlier you can pull the vendor in, again, seeing the vendor as a partner. One thing we do with some of the fitness apps specifically, Runkeeper, is we share mocks with and even early versions of copy with the vendor, so they know it's coming. They can be preparing mentally for that creative copy that we need them to write in a quick turnaround time. So really having an open communication with your vendor will increase the quality of the product, the output as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so before we go into Q&A, I have just one last question, which would be more about anything that you could take away from the situation, things that you maybe like did differently because of the situation and that you actually benefited from and you'd like to take into the future. Is there anything that you can think of that that you plan to retain that came out of this crisis?
For me, minimizing touch points, I keep mentioning, but like Hanato mentioned before, similar to him, I worked in like a Six Sigma lean manufacturing background prior to localization, and we had to minimize and streamline the process quite a bit for some of these product changes that we wanted to get out the door quickly, and that is something that I would like to explore keeping.
Yeah, I think for us, I think a lot of companies are going to have similar learnings and takeaways. I think one of the biggest ones that I see as like an overarching theme, and that probably caught most people by surprise, is just preparing for uncertain situations and having some kind of contingency plan or mitigation plan when things arise that are just outside of your control. I think when you're talking about really building a company and prioritizing on the bigger scale, you always have like a list of priorities. Like I want to do this because of this. I want to do that because of that. And a lot of those are great because you can control them and they're internally driven by whether your base of users or your, whatever the situation, but there are also factors that are external that we just can't control. And those are things like the current situation that hasn't, no one orchestrated that. It just like happens. And it's something that we have to realize, like as companies, are we able to react to an external situation and like keep going, pick up and change as needed, or are we going to just let that external problem really affect us? And I think that's something that we really, myself included, have just been really focused on. And I think a lot of other companies are probably going to be thinking about keeping lean teams and making sure that you're not going outside of your means and things like that. I think in a lot of situations we'll probably see some evolution there, but it's kind of hard to know, I think. But generally speaking, that's kind of what I'm seeing.
Just trying to stay flexible and agile to
sure.
be able to deal with. Yeah, great. Okay, so I think, are there any questions from the audience?
There are. I mean, people have been pumping some questions in, so that's great stuff.
Yeah.
There are a few. So I'm going to start with one of the ones that has talks about your vendor structure. So how does uncertainty prevent any of you from looking at changing your vendor structure at the moment? Has there been any consideration to that or anything to that effect?
Yeah, how does it prevent? I don't think it's preventing us in a sense from changing vendor. I think it's a good question. I think if I understand the person who's asking the question, it might be an angle of like, there might be some inactivity on the market right now with people hesitant to move forward or to onboard new people, or that's kind of how I'm interpreting the question. But I think it's probably preventing things in a way that there might be budgetary concerns. There might be concerns from a company about future demand. You know, like what are the futures? Like how do we know if we invest in, you know, let's say that there's a new product that's a great tool, that's the #1 tool in the market for doing something. If I go to a leader at the company right now and I say, hey, I want to do this because it's going to help us in this, they might say, well, how do we know this is going to be effective right now? We've got a lot of things going on. It's kind of hard to make really sound strategic decisions without all the information. I think in terms of having a new vendor, like a new localization vendor or something like that, I don't think that's necessarily going to slow down, assuming there's a need for proper vendor alignment. Like myself included, I'm actually moving forward with some initiatives right now that are vendor related. So we're not necessarily stopped, but there are some other areas where I've actually put the brakes on, and I've said, I've basically told anyone I was in contact with, like, we're probably not going to do anything for a while. So I just don't want to get anybody's hopes up. So I think it can affect it, but it really depends on some factors.
Okay, excellent. Hilary, did you want to weigh in on that?
I would agree. Yeah, I think that there's some things are paused and some things are moving forward. I am also moving forward with some different projects that will require new vendors, but it just depends on the company. I can see some companies maybe being on like a spending freeze. That's not our case. I do think that, like Andy was mentioning, a lot of baselines are out the door. You don't know what the baseline is anymore because the future is so different. So I can see that creating some uncertainty.
Do you think, because you guys both have like really great vendor relationships, so everything went smoothly in this kind of crisis, do you think that if something had broken down in that process while you're trying to like respond to the situation, do you think that would have been kind of a difficult moment for you to then switch to someone else or to think about other options? Like, would you have kind of tried to work through that with them?
Absolutely, I would have tried to work through it. Yeah, our vendors are so embedded in our process. They're really valuable. So I don't think that, everybody makes mistakes. In this case, everything went smoothly, but if it hadn't, I think it would have just been like an opportunity for growth.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's important to remain human at this point and realize that everyone's going through a lot of things, and you can't always interpret the situation that other people are going through. So you have to make sure that we're balancing for that as well.
I think those are great answers, and I think they've been echoed in other presentations as well, like the empathy aspect, the human aspect. So I think that's great to bring it back to that again, because we're all going through something, right? And we're all being impacted in different ways. So I think that's a really great point. There's another question with respect to turnarounds. So have you seen, for example, an increase in turnaround from your internal stakeholders? So those who are purchasing products internally, have they increased any type of deliveries?
Yeah, so you mean like the end users of the product?
Actually, from what I understood, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this question, but it seems like the people internally that are actually working on your projects. So has there been, or maybe it's your vendors as well, perhaps, but has there been an increase in turnaround? So are they actually working quicker in order to turn these things around for you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's working faster. Yes.
Yeah. Same. We've had some increased demand as well.
Excellent. Okay. One specifically to Hilary. Can you give an example of the degree of touch point reduction you achieved from 10 to 5, 20, 25 to 23? Did you find places where you inserted a touch point because it was required that it required a human to do the task?
No, we didn't add any additional touch points. All of the review touch points were the same. We did involve our translators and vendors sooner in the process so that they would have more time to have a better idea. So like I mentioned earlier, with them seeing UX, UI mocks of the final product. So normally I would send them like the final design, but in this case, I was showing them sometimes even sketches of designs. So by the time they got the translations, they could just turn it around quick. So that's a touch point that was added. What was the rating part of the question?
10 to 5 or 25 to 23 or something to that effect. So there was just one.
Half our turnaround time.
Yeah.
Cut it in half. Yeah.
Cut it in half. Wow, that's fantastic. One of the other questions, and this is again a general question, because we have just another minute before we, or a couple of minutes before we have to time out. But have you done any? And this was again echoed in other sessions in the panel I was on earlier this afternoon. It mentioned it as well. But have you done any specific activities for team building within your organization? So there was one person, for example, that mentioned they had Zoom pet time, so everybody was bringing in their pets and had like yoga moments and things like that. So are you guys doing anything creative or fun to that effect?
Yeah, I think our company, at a company-wide level, I think bigger companies, there's a tendency for teams to operate differently. And I think like some teams are probably having happy hours every week. Some other teams are probably on call so much that at the end of the day, they're ready to just watch a movie or something. And I think there's different levels of that. And I think we have, as a company, we've probably got plenty of support groups for people, like whether it's, pet channels for people who want to talk about pets and share pictures of pets, or whether it's interest channels or whatever. I think on my team, one of the things I've done as a manager is I've just tried to be available to my team. So like anyone who needs to talk, or like, I would talk with my team like regularly, just, let them talk about what they're going through, anything if they want to chat. So I think that's something is just, there are different levels. There's like the company level and there's like the managerial level. And I think that the company level, I think we've got the structure in place to provide everyone with what they need in these times.
Okay, excellent. Hilary, did you have any input on that one?
I would echo that. I mean, today it was like bring your child to work day. So we had our kids on our work calls, which was fun. So at a company level, our HR department is stellar. Had, yoga classes, mental health. Okay. They provided mental health resources for all of the employees. We have happy hours. We have had all kinds of competitions and games, and so it's pushing all the teams, like I said earlier, to be creative and to think creatively to solve problems, both internal and external. Excellent.
So yeah, I'd love to see the creative aspects that everybody's trying to, to bring people together, especially in the larger organizations. I think I think it's a positive thing, and I'm really enjoying seeing the different ways in which they're doing it. Again, it's a question to Hilary. So with Asics being, it's to both. Asics and Tinder both being very known and physical brands. Do you expect any changes in the way that you market your products post-pandemic?
Hilary, do you have any thoughts? I have some thoughts, but I can't, I don't know. Yeah, so this is a super interesting question, actually. I think in the short term, I would say that, most companies are probably not going to do a lot of marketing just because they don't know if it's valuable to spend marketing dollars right now. If you're talking about purely marketing, I think longer term, I mean, the hope and okay, let me break this down. I think the problem is not knowing where things are going to be in the future is not knowing how to market to that. Like if there's if the new norm for the next year or two is social distancing, you have to market to that. You have to figure out a way to market to that. But if we find a way to cure this in 6 months and life goes back to normal, it's a non-issue, right? Or at least for the time being, hopefully. Sure. So I think that is a big factor in like how we are going to adapt our marketing efforts. But I think in general, I think we, as well as any other company, is going to have to adapt to the situation and understand that there are going to be some changes from this, most likely on a macro scale, and that might require offering features in the products that we serve that are tailored to digital interactions more, or like whether that's or communications improvements, or things like that. I think we're going to probably have to evolve at some point. Like all companies are going to have to evolve to do that. I think in a post marketing, like how we market posts, I think is really going to be determined on how the world is able to come through this situation.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had, I think there are some trends that you want to watch, the way people are approaching fitness, for example. Fitness is completely different. Participating in races is completely different. We've offered some product pivots for that, and we're marketing those so that people can access them. But I don't know how long term that will be. We'll continue to work out from home. This is over, will they say, like, I don't need a gym, I can work out in my house? Then that might change, the way people are approaching dating relationships or exercise. So we'll have to see.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I don't know, Kristy, did you have anything that you wanted to add or, ask a couple of final questions? We've got just a couple of minutes left, so final statements would be welcomed.
Yeah, no, I think in terms of like how companies are marketing differently, we're seeing that in kind of the topics of content that we're creating for different clients. I think, everyone's kind of trying to adapt and also find like the level of sensitivity. That's kind of a challenging point, I think, and it's probably going to shift moving forward. So yeah, it's a challenging space, I think, right now for everyone. Yeah.
Great. Well, I mean, listen, the comments I've seen go through the channel have been super positive about everybody here. So everyone's sharing their love, which is fantastic. I wanted to thank you all for obviously spending time with us here today. I'm hoping that you'll have the chance to connect with some other people, maybe in the Slack channel afterwards. Maybe just through LinkedIn or what have you. I've actually sent out invitations to all of you as well. So I wanted to thank you for that.